back to the channel. Today we're going to be talking about I Shot Marvin in the Face, a Pulp Fiction caricature in Procreate. I had a lot of fun with this one. I think I'm going to kind of start off by saying that right off the bat. I've been looking forward to doing a caricature like this for some time. I'm a big fan of Pulp Fiction, and it was very much a part of my upbringing when I was a little bit younger. So let's just kind of get the basics out of the way from the get-go. Pulp Fiction was a movie that came out in 1994, directed by Quentin Tarantino, and in order to kind of give a brief synopsis of what this movie was about, I googled the movie title, and this is what it said. I kind of thought this was a little entertaining. Vincent Vega, John Travolta, and Jules Winnfield, played by Samuel L. Jackson, are hitmen with a penchant for philosophical discussions. And I think it's a pretty good summary of what this movie is about, even though it kind of does leave out some bits and pieces. But in terms of trying to get an idea of what this picture is about, I think that kind of hits the nail on the head. So let's break this down a little bit. We're doing a caricature here of Jules and Vincent, John Travolta and Samuel L. Jackson. And this is kind of inspired by a scene that takes place a little bit later in the movie where John Travolta accidentally shoots a character in the face who's sitting in the backseat of the car that they're driving in. The blood splatter and everything will be added in towards kind of the end of this drawing. But for right now, why don't we just take some time and focus on the caricature itself? We have two main caricatures going on here, the Samuel Jackson and the John Travolta. So let's kind of start by talking about John Travolta, and we'll bring back in Samuel Jackson a little bit. John Travolta was just a little bit difficult, or maybe challenging might be the word, to kind of figure out how I wanted to draw him. The scene that you see in the movie is a little bit difficult to get some reference off of, and it's mostly related to the fact that when you see the movie, the camera is focused in on the figure in the foreground, which is the Samuel Jackson. John Travolta, in the background of those shots, is completely out of focus just because of how the camera work was going down. So trying to get a really good reference photo that had both of these faces in focus to do a good caricature was just nearly impossible. Not to mention the fact that John Travolta, in a lot of that, had his face looking down and looking to the side and all over the place, because at this point in the scene, he was surprised by the gunshot going off. So getting this face on kind of front view of his head just didn't exist, and I had to pull some different reference photos for some different areas in the movie to try to kind of get the staging and the composition that I was going for here. When you saw a little bit earlier the two faces of John Travolta, that was really kind of trying to decide on whether or not I wanted to do that front-on view or the three-quarters side view, which may have been a little bit easier, but there were certain things that I knew that I wanted to kind of include in my caricature which wouldn't have been involved in that three-quarter view. Specifically, the dimple in the chin. So this is how I approach caricatures in general. If I close my eyes and I think about which celebrity or which face I'm trying to draw, what is the first thing that stands out to me? And as far as I'm concerned, John Travolta becomes that jawline with that very distinct dimple in his chin. And a lot of that face shape and that dimple would have been lost if I went for a different kind of point of view on the face. So it seemed pretty clear to me that this full-on front view of the face was the way to go, and it made the caricature a little bit easier to do because I could focus on that shape of the jawline and the dimple in the chin. Now, I've talked about this before in some other videos, but it really kind of, I think, drives this point home in this particular picture, the concept of trying to create balance in these caricatures. So I knew the exaggeration with Travolta was going to be in this large jaw, the large chin, and so some other things needed to be shrunken down a little bit to kind of create balance in that shape of the head. And I did that in the eyes. Now, I'm talking about this, but I can say the same thing about what just appeared on your screen. We're going to focus our attention on the Samuel Jackson caricature, and the same kind of principle was applied. If we're talking about caricatures, there's a couple different ways to kind of approach this. You can certainly go with something of a literal resemblance, which some people do, and then there's also this idea of trying to create some sense of capturing the character in your caricature as well. And so when I'm thinking about Jules or Samuel Jackson, I think big mouth because they're very loud and boisterous. So again, I knew big mouth with the hair the way that it is, this over-the-top wig that Samuel Jackson's wearing. It was pretty obvious I was going to exaggerate the hair as well, having it spill completely off the frame. But that means that something had to kind of shrink down in size to accommodate that balance, that sense of balance that we were talking about earlier. So that nose, and really kind of the eyes a little bit as well, helped create balance in the face. Big mouth, big hair, small upper portion of the face, specifically that nose. And that kind of explains why I went the direction that I went with it. I'm in my inking phase right now, So this is where I'm kind of solidifying where I want these lines to lie, and I talk a lot about line weight in previous videos. You'll see a lot of it exemplified here as well. When I use the reference photo in here, and this is something I did have a very good reference photo for, it was just a still image from the movie and from this scene with Samuel Jackson right in focus in the middle of the frame there, so it was really easy to kind of see how his hair kind of worked. Again, I really feel like this was an over-the-top wig. It was so obvious in the movie, but that meant that I really had a lot of individual strands of hair that I needed to draw around the edges of this kind of afro that's going on the top of his head. I didn't want to overdo it, I didn't want to underdo it, and I knew that at some point or another when I was getting into the coloring phase of this, I was going to have to create a light source that's shown on the front of his face from the windshield of the car, and that was going to reflect off of his hair as well. I didn't really have a plan as to how I was going to do this, but I knew it wasn't just going to be a full black, flat piece of hair. I was going to have to kind of mess with the rendering on that at some point or another. So I felt like those individual little strands and curls that are in there were going to help when I got to that phase of the coloring. So I was very specific about it. I played around with it a lot until I got it just the way I liked it. And then it was pretty easy just to kind of dial in the rest of the line work. To put this out there as far as the layers, just so we're clear, when we get into the coloring phase, the layers are going to be a little bit more obvious. But for right now, let me just let you know that it kind of follows something of a logic. The far background is going to be some sort of a sky and ground. Then there will be the car door in front of that. John Travolta will be in front of the car door, Samuel Jackson in front of John Travolta, but also the hand on the steering wheel is a layer all on its own, and it sits far in the foreground, so it can be colored individually and a little bit easier to kind of get some of that rendering done. So this is the part where I know that I've got most of my line work kind of laid out, but I'm going back into my previous layers just to make sure that I get every layer its own kind of fine line work to make the coloring a little bit easier. One of the reasons that I really like working with these bold black outlines, at least initially to start off with, is because of that coloring phase. When we get into coloring and I want to start kind of filling in flat kind of mid-tone colors quickly, it's a lot easier to have these bold black lines so I can just do color fills rather than sitting there spending all day filling things in like I'm a crayon in a coloring book, basically. So I do a lot of color fills when we get to that stage, and it just kind of speeds up that beginning process of the coloring for me. If I'm going to be spending a lot of time on something, I'd like to be spending a lot of time on the shadows and the light sources, and that area, that piece of time you spend coloring just those midtones can get really boring, and so those color fills really kind of speed the whole thing up. But if you're going to use it effectively, it all starts with your line work and making sure that you have these bold lines that are closed off, that don't have openings for that color fill to spill out. And so, you know, even though I'm trying to kind of rush a little bit through the coloring phase, at least in the beginning, I will spend more time on my line work to give me that freedom when I get to that next stage. Hopefully that makes sense. All right, so we're doing the line work and the inking here on John Travolta now. And to speak a little bit more about the caricature, I'd like to go back and revisit that balance in the face. So again, the jawline is humongous here. The nose is a little bit oversized as well. But how do we compensate? We take the top half of his head, shrink it down. It may not be as obvious in the hairline because of how big his hair is, but if you take a look at the eyes, that's really where you kind of see how much we've got exaggerated the smallness to balance out the larger features down below the eye line. Now, that's something that might be a little bit effective as well if you're just starting in caricatures. If you're trying to get an idea as to where to start with the drawing, one of the first things you may want to take a look at is the shape of the head itself. Forget just for a moment about the individual features like eye, nose, and mouth, but focus on the head itself. In the beginning phase of your caricature, what you want to do is get an idea of where to achieve your balance, top to bottom, left to right. So if we take a look at John Travolta, for example, the top half of his head, basically the area above his eye line, is actually smaller than the area below his eye line. Think of it almost like mass. There's less mass on the top of his head than there is on the bottom of his head. And again, I'm using that eye line as the kind of the midpoint there. And you can see that very much exaggerating this caricature. That top of the head is very much less mass than that huge jaw that's below it. And if you look at photos of John Travolta, you'll see that that's where that exaggeration came from. And again, it's a good way to kind of start with your caricatures. If you're looking at Samuel Jackson, I kind of employed the same philosophy. Just take the hair out of the situation. It can mislead you a little bit, but the lower half of his face has more mass than the upper half of his face. That's why he has tiny nose, but a large jaw, large mouth, etc. As we move into this next phase of the line drawing here, I have to admit freely that I'm not really much of a gun enthusiast. I don't mind guns, I just don't particularly, or I don't specifically own one personally, although I do have friends that do. I've fired guns before, but drawing them is just not something I do much of. So I spent a lot of time with reference photos trying to get this gun drawing as accurate as I possibly could. This was a drawing that really had a focus on the gun because of the big punchline at the end that he shot somebody in the face. So the gun had to be involved, and cheating it and just making it some vague shape just didn't seem like it was going to cut it as far as this particular drawing was concerned. It was an important plot element to the idea of this illustration, so it had to be included, and it had to be something that was very much in frame and not partially hidden. I also had to, kind of start thinking about how I was going to render it in terms of shadow and light, because I wanted to give that illusion that is metal and has an appropriate kind of texture to it, to give the idea that it's metal as opposed to the cloth behind it and the flesh tones and so on and so forth. So the line drawing again became very important in this, and the line drawing was based off of reference photos that I actually found through Google of Vincent Vega's gun, the gun that he actually used in Pulp Fiction. All right, now as we get into the coloring phase here, I tend to kind of work background to foreground a little bit. So I started with the background knowing that I had to have something behind the car windows, something that they were driving, and you had some sort of a blurred vision of something in the background. I threw some light color in here just to get some blues in, to have some sort of a tone to work with, but later I decided I wasn't happy with it after I started getting the figures a little bit more colored in, and decided to change it and add some greens to represent some trees or shrubbery that they were driving past. For right now, it'll suffice. Coloring into the car interior was fairly easy. It's all mostly monotone with a slightly darker shade to give some sense of a beginning of shadow. And then we start blocking out the main layers for coloring on the figures. So green was John Travolta, and the reason he's green is because I'm trying to block his entire figure in one color, and I can use that blocked color as a reference to make sure that when I do coloring later for the specific areas of the flesh or the hair or the gun, that I can kind of color and put in shadow without having to worry about coloring outside the lines. So what I do is I color the entire figure in one color, something big and bold like this green, and then every layer I build on top of that is used as a clipping mask. And that clipping mask will ensure that no matter where I try to lay down color, it doesn't go outside my initial line work. It won't go outside the initial pixel set that I'd set up in this green color before. Now, if you have any questions about that or how that's achieved or why it's so effective, feel free to leave some comments in the comments section, and what I might do in the future is some sort of a video where I actually put a camera on Procreate itself so you can see how I'm building the layers. Again, if you have some interest in that, let me know in the comments and I'll try to address that in the future. Now, because I'm working in layers, I have this ability to take Samuel Jackson completely out of the equation for a while and focus on the shadows that John Travolta throws off, specifically into the car interior. So you can see there's a little bit of a hint of shadow in the roof headliner there where his head's sitting, and then also in the car door that's behind his shoulder. There is a weird shape that sits off in the lower right-hand corner, and that's going to be the seat that Samuel Jackson is sitting in the foreground. So that'll make a little bit more sense when we bring him back into the picture. Right now, you'll see me adding some tone to John Travolta's face. This is something I do with most of my figures, and I'll do the same thing with Sam Jackson a little bit. Basically, once I kind of get my flat colors in and I start kind of dealing with the rendering, I stop for a second, put in another layer right above the skin color, and just add red to it. Now, the red doesn't go everywhere, it's just a little bit blotchy, but it goes in places where the blood kind of comes close to the surface of the face, where the skin gets a little bit thinner. Take a look in a mirror sometime and see where that does it on you. Nobody's face is perfectly one color. That's why women tend to wear, makeup to kind of smooth out and even out that tone. But men, not wearing makeup typically, you can see this a lot more obviously. Red tends to come to the surface of the nose, portions of the forehead, cheeks, ears as well, and a little bit of the chin. Now, your mileage may vary. Different people are different, and then that means that you may not be as pronounced in the chin or may not be as pronounced in the forehead, but almost always you'll see it in the middle of the face, in the nose and the ears specifically. So once I put that blotchy color in, then I just use the smudge tool to kind of smooth it out a little bit, and sometimes I use that red to kind of help accentuate some of my shadows as well. Depending on who I'm working on or how I want those shadows to lie or what parts of the face I'm trying to emphasize, that red can be an effective tool. And what I'm using it for today is to help accentuate John Travolta's cheekbones there. Okay. Now, I haven't finished putting in my shadow, but I'm putting in light anyway. I found a long time ago that if I try to render all my shadow without putting in any light, then I tend to go a little bit too dark or too light, or nothing really kind of gets balanced at the end. So what I'm trying to do here is put in a little bit of the shadow, stop, then work on another layer while I add in a little bit of my light, and work back and forth until I feel like I've achieved that three-dimensional effect that I'm ultimately striving for. And again, it comes back to that word I've been using all the way up until now, is that concept of balance. It's one of those things where I kind of feel like I'll know it when I see it, but bear in mind here, I do have a reference photo of John Travolta's head that I'm using to kind of help inform some of these decisions I'm making. How much light to use, how much shadow, how much of his head is in shadow, and how dark that shadow is. One of the other things that was a little bit of a challenge here, and you know, might kind of explain a couple of questions that are coming up if you haven't seen them already, is that part of his suit is black, but the other part is green. So what am I doing with the coloring here? Well, I figured out early on that there was going to be a little bit of a overlap between the two jackets that the two gentlemen here are wearing. So John Travolta's dressed up in a black suit, but guess what? So Samuel Jackson. And there's going to be a piece of this painting, a piece of this artwork, where the two jackets will overlap, and it's going to create something that looks flat, and you won't be able to see John Travolta sitting in the background a little bit more if I don't work to correct that somehow. So there's a couple different ways I kind of address this, a couple different ways I kind of had ideas as to how I was going to address this, but mostly what it came down to was trying to get John Travolta's jacket to look a little bit more blue and a little bit more gray to help him sit in the background a little bit more and hopefully create some sort of a sense of depth. Now, I knew that I was going to have to address it eventually, but it's not really helpful to address it until I get Samuel Jackson back into the frame. So it's something I'm ignoring for right now, but that's why I have the green portion there that I know I'm going to be coloring, and then there's a black portion on the right-hand side of the figure that I'm going to be painting over later once I bring Samuel Jackson back in. If you have questions about the three blobs over on the left-hand side, I do this in just about every single one of my paintings. It is my palette, and more specifically, it's my shadow and light palette. So here's my theory. The main light source that's kind of informing this piece is coming from the glass in the car. So basically, it's sunlight coming in through the windshield and through the car window that's bringing the light source in from the left-hand side, illuminating the left-hand side of John Travolta's face, and then the front of Samuel Jackson's face. Because it's sunlight we're dealing with, I'm treating the sunlight as a warm light source, kind of a yellowish, orange, pinkish type thing. And that's what I have there in that first kind of blob up at the top. So that's my light source, is that kind of pinkish blob. And again, I just want to kind of let you know how I made this color. I picked it on my color wheel, but what I strove for here is to know that I was going with something warm, but also very desaturated. I wanted gray in this quite a bit. And the reason why is because it's going to be used as a blend mode a little bit later on. So even though pinkish gray is what I'm using as a color, the only time I'm really applying it to the painting is when I'm putting it on a layer that's been set to a specific blend mode. Now that blend mode might vary depending on which painting I'm working on and how intense I want that light source to be. I often use linear light, sometimes I use add, sometimes I use soft light, and in this particular one I believe add was the one that I kind of settled with. Add tends to work really well with yellows and oranges, and so I kind of tend to default to that if I'm putting light on flesh. It's just, again, a preference of mine, but depending on the light source, like if I'm, shining purple light on something, I might make some different choices just to be kind of clear about that. So if we move on with the rest of the blobs there, again, the pinkish color there is our light source, and then the two bluer blobs are going to be my shadows. They're meant to be something of the opposite of the light source here. So I have a warm light, I have a cool shadow, and I have two different types of shadow. The first one there, the one that's kind of the middle blob, the lighter blue blob, is just that. It's blue, very desaturated, very grayish, and it will be used with a multiply blend mode on its layer to paint in the shadow. And it doesn't matter where I put that shadow, because I'm using it as a blend mode, it will automatically kind of match wherever I paint it over. So I'm using that same light blue on a multiply mode to paint in shadows on the flesh, just as much I'm using it to paint in the shadows on the shirt and on the car door behind him, and it will just match the color up automatically. So that way I don't have to worry about pulling out different colors for different shadows in different areas. Now there may be places where I want a darker, deeper shadow, or maybe a light, more subtle shadow, and when it comes to things like that, then I will use other types of brushes to help achieve that effect. So what I mean by other brushes is I might use a smudge brush, like maybe on an airbrush setting on a smudge tool to kind of help lighten things up a little bit if that shadow's too dark or too dense. And in other times, if I feel like I really need to kind of pull something out of it very, very quickly, I might put the airbrush tool on the eraser and then just turn down the opacity so just very, very light passes will go over the shadow and lighten it up gradually until I get the effect that I'm looking for. So that's how I get some blends and how I get some softer shadows. And then in other places I might want some harder shadows, so I won't go back over it. I'll just kind of draw it in as bold as I can. I use a similar type of approach when I'm doing the light sources as well. The main difference here, though, is that you'll notice that I only have one color in my palette for light, but two for shadows. So the first kind of shadow is that lighter blue, and then we have something of a deeper gray that's going to be a darker shadow. Now that darker shadow still has some blue in it, so it's still kind of in that same color family. It's a cool shadow, but there are going to be places where I want a deeper, darker shadow, like in the recesses of the car, for instance, or in the portions of the shadow where it gets very, very close to the jacket overlaying it. There are just going to be some places where you want just dense shadow, and you know it's easy to do overkill there, make your piece look muddy, but I do find that that second layer of shadow is often necessary to really kind of get that full 3 dimensions and balance out the light that you're putting in. Now again, 2 shadows, only 1 light, and there's really a reason for that as well. There is a second light, a brighter light, if you will, that I will get into and use, but it's basically going to be almost pure white. It's going to be the highlights that go in the end, around like the eyeballs, for instance, and places where the light is really kind of shining and I want almost a reflection. So again, I deal with kind of like 2 lights, 2 darks, warm light, cool shadow, although different pieces I might flip that up a little bit, kind of depending on the nature of what I'm working with. Now, for the most part, I feel like I've kind of finished up John Travolta. I'm working in the jacket now, so what's happening here is I'm getting along this idea that I've got to start dealing with his jacket, but create it in such a way, or render it in such a way, that it's not getting confused or getting muddied or muddled with Samuel Jackson's jacket. So notice again, the shoulder there of Samuel Jackson kind of overlaps one of John Travolta's shoulders, and I got to make sure that I render it in such a way that John Travolta actually sits back and creates a sense of depth. So I know that I'm going a little bit more gray with his jacket on the left-hand side. His right-hand side of his jacket is going to be more in shadow, but I still got to kind of get it away from that pure black, so that way there's that sense of depth created. I think I may have forgot to mention this before, so I'll bring it up right now. I've talked a little bit about the gun, but the gun and the hand that is holding that gun are also on their own separate layers, so it was easier to paint in the shadows on the shirt and the jacket behind it. That's kind of the strategy I go with. The reason I'm creating multiple layers and multiple layers for the figure even is just to make shadows easier to paint in. If I had that line drawing of the gun and the hand on the same layer as the jacket, then I'm going to be spending all day painting around it as I try to put in shadow, and sometimes that can mean that the shadow is going to be on a different depth or a different shade on one side of the gun as the other side of the gun. You do that and your illusion's almost ruined, or at least in my opinion anyway. So in order to make it a little bit easier to get shadow in and get it consistent and make it look as natural as I want it to look, it's a simple fix. It's just kind of thinking ahead, almost like it's like a chess game almost. Think like 5 stages ahead or 5 moves ahead, and you'll kind of figure out along the way that that gun needs to be on its own layer just to make it easier to paint the shadows later on. It took me a while to get satisfied with John Travolta's jacket. I'll kind of be honest on that one. I knew that he was wearing a black suit, so I really didn't want to go with a light gray, but I kind of felt like I had to in order to pull off the sense of depth that I wanted to. So we're going to chalk this one up to artistic license. If you want to argue that he's wearing a black suit and that's the end-all be-all, I'm not going to disagree with you. But in order to make it work as a completed and balanced piece, I really needed to kind of create more blue in the background there, and that blue helps it recede a little bit and give it a sense of depth. It's one of those tricks I kind of pull from time to time, is that I might make things a little bit more blue if I know that I want them to recede in the back. This is something I kind of learned from just like looking at landscapes and landscape paintings in general. If you ever look at landscape paintings, the more you go into the background, the more the artist or even the photograph will seem to go kind of blue. I don't know what causes this phenomenon. Maybe it's like sky or atmosphere or the thickness of air or whatever you want to call it. But it is just something of a natural phenomenon that seems to happen. The more you go in the background, and again, you can see this a lot in landscapes because of the distance that you can kind of see back. You can see for miles if you're looking at the right landscape. But the more you go into the back, the more you get into like mountains or like forest or something like that, even though the trees might be green, they start kind of looking almost like a blue-green the more you recede into the background. So anytime I'm trying to do something in background, a couple things I kind of do just to kind of, cheat that depth effect is I go with that blue filter over the top of it, even though it may be a very, very subtle blue, but also less detail. So you can blur things a little bit, kind of make your lines a little less detailed, and that will kind of sell that idea that you're working in something with more depth also. So I'm finishing up the jacket here with John Travolta, which means in the very, very near future, we're going to be focusing on Samuel Jackson. And I thought this might be a good opportunity to talk a little bit about trying to render Caucasian flesh versus darker flesh. I'll be the first person to admit that the first time I started kind of trying to do caricatures of people with darker skin, it's a little bit intimidating. You don't want to be insulting. You don't want to be, in any way perceived as being, off base or distasteful or racist or anything like that. And so I'd like to kind of state from the get-go, that's never my intention. I'm trying to do a caricature, and in that things are exaggerated, but not meant in any way, shape, or form to be disrespectful, especially to somebody I respect as much as Samuel Jackson, or even, a piece I did a little while ago of Prince. If anything, I'm trying to honor the characters and the musician Prince himself, but I'm trying to honor these people, so hopefully I've been somewhat successful at that. But having said that, darker flesh doesn't really have a whole lot of rules to change in terms of trying to render shadow and light. Now, we are painting with some different color palettes, certainly, but shadow and light doesn't work any different on darker flesh than it does on lighter flesh. And so you'll see that I'm kind of following a lot of the similar rules and still kind of pull off an effect I think is quite effective. So I start by kind of blocking in the darker color that I want for the mid-tone of the flesh, but you'll notice here that I immediately go back into that red that I did with John Travolta. So red on the chin and on the cheeks, but get it into the nose and into the ear there a little bit. And remember, I've got a reference photo I'm using here for this, so this isn't just something I'm making up off the top of my head. I'm really trying to kind of see where those reds kind of evolve naturally, paint them in, blend them in to match kind of the rest, and you'll see as the shadow and the light go in, that red will become a little bit more subtle. Again, because I'm using a reference photo here, it was pretty easy to kind of see where the light source played off the front of the face, and to be able to kind of paint the shadows in around it. Now, with Samuel Jackson, because he's facing forward like this, we're getting almost a true profile. Seeing the planes on the face here to get in the shadow and the light actually becomes a little bit easier, because the face, for the most part, is kind of flat on either side of the head. So if you're going back to kind of fundamentals and you're talking about how to draw heads, we usually start with something of a big circle that's meant to represent the top of the skull, and then maybe some sort of a square shape to get in the jawline and so on and so forth. But what a lot of people don't necessarily do right away, or maybe it's just something that kind of comes up a little bit later, is when you're starting to draw faces, especially if you're drawing them face on, you chop off the sides of the circle on either side where the ears would be, because that part of the skull is relatively flat. And because we're turning Samuel Jackson's face to the side here, that flat side of the face is basically just all in shadow. So you can see how I painted that in there. I painted the cheeks and pretty much everything back in almost complete shadow, and then the light source comes around the tip of the cheek, and of course in the chin area as well, and that's it. I've sold that idea that I've got some sense of 3 dimensions here. And it's really just mostly because of one big blocked out shadow. Now, there are a couple little details to add in, like a little bit of a highlight shining off the ear, for instance. And again, we'll have to go in and doctor up the hair a little bit as well to give it some light source. But ultimately, it's the cheek, I think, that really kind of sells this 3-dimensional effect more than anything else on this face. And that's why you may notice I'm going back in there and adding a couple more shades in there to get a little bit more darker, because I want more of a contrast between the light and the dark to really get that full 3-dimensional effect that I'm striving for here. Now, let's talk a little bit about hair. The hair when John Travolta was something I just kind of put a couple of stripes in really quick because he's got that very, very dense, thick black hair. And to a certain degree, so does Samuel Jackson, but you got to remember the light source here is coming in the front. So if I don't do something to paint in some light source on the front of his hair, then the face looks 3-dimensional, but the hair looks flat. It just can't be a flat black. I've got to get in there and do something with it. And because it's not straight and just kind of streaky like John Travolta's hair is, I've really got some work to do because I've got to figure out some sort of a way to represent the curls that are in here but also do it in such a way that it's not going to be the entire head of hair, and it can sell the idea that it is three-dimensional, but without over-rendering it and drawing in every single little strand. So this is where texture brushes really kind of become useful. But I'm going to say something that I say in pretty much every video where this topic comes up, and I really kind of want to hammer down the point. I am not a huge believer in brushes solving your art problems. I don't think a magic brush somehow makes you a better artist or better at rendering something. Brushes can be useful tools to be able to kind of help render a texture you're trying to strive for, but it's not necessarily going to save the day and make it a better piece of work. I think that really kind of comes in the drawing itself. But can they be useful tools to help render an effect? Yeah, and if you use them correctly for that, then by all means. But the reason I bring all that up is just to let you know that when it comes to any of these brushes that I'm using, in this piece or pretty much any other, I'm not really going outside the standard brush set that Procreate provides for you. So the brush I'm using right now, just to kind of get some light source into Samuel's hair, is really just a, I believe it's a texture brush that came from the Details menu. I believe it's actually the short hair brush, if I'm not mistaken. Now, it was a little bit too bold. The lines were a little bit too crisp. So once I got them in and got some idea of where I wanted the light source to go, then I went in with a smudge tool and kind of just smudged that in, so it wasn't so, I don't know, crisp and clean, so to speak. I wanted kind of a little bit of a light source in there, but that line work was just too much. Now, I'll go back and touch it up a little bit. So basically, it's just a matter of going in there, putting in some lines, smudging, putting in some more lines, smudging, and then I kind of felt like it was getting a little bit too much, so I went in with an eraser and erased a lot of it back, so I could start over again and put in a couple more lines to get a little bit more definition. I did this over and over and over again, and again, balance is the magic word here. So I'll paint it in, smudge, erase, paint in, smudge, erase, and then a little bit later I went in with some different brushes to try to create some different effects and textures. For instance, I'm no longer working with a hair texture brush right there. Those last couple of lines were painted in using the marker tool. So the marker tool just has some kind of irregularities and holes in the line there a little bit that I thought really kind of maybe kind of sold the effect I was going for. Now, you may have seen me do this in a previous video, and it just kind of passed right now. You may have noticed an orange filter just kind of popped up over everything. This is how I kind of help separate depth sometimes. In the background, with John Travolta, there's a blue layer over everything. The whole thing is that it's barely visible because I've just turned down the opacity down to maybe about 5% or so. So it's subtle, but it's there, and again, it goes back to the idea that I mentioned before. The more things go into the background, the more they kind of get a little bit more blue of a tint to them. The orange was for the foreground, so I want to create contrast by putting in opposite colors. So anything that is Samuel Jackson has an orange filter over top of it. Again, lower the opacity down to about 5% or so. And then what I also did was I just erased that orange anywhere that Samuel Jackson didn't exist. So if it wasn't a pixel that applied to the Samuel Jackson figure, then it was erased away so we could see that blue and John Travolta behind it. It's subtle, but it really makes a big difference. And because this is something that I've already drawn before, I can't go back and kind of switch it on and off to show you the difference. But again, if it's something you're interested in, or if you have questions about it, just feel free to leave them in the comments, and maybe I'll make a video about it in the future to kind of get a little bit more obvious about how that effect is pulled off. In the meantime, you may just kind of notice here that there's not really a whole lot else to do. What we're kind of striving for at this point is just working on some basic detail work. So I'm working on that little strand that kind of comes out of the rest of John Travolta's hair that's a little bit different and falls over his forehead. You'll see me tweaking a little bit more on the hair of Samuel Jackson. Highlights still need to go into the eyes and into the lips, and just some other places that might catch the light here and there. And if I'm not mistaken, I might even go back and tweak in a couple little parts of the car's interior before I kind of finish this whole thing off. Now, back at the beginning of the video, you may remember that I dealt with the background, the area outside of that car window and windshield, as kind of first thing. And I treated it in blue, but the thing about that is now everything in the background is blue, and it's getting a little bit boring. So I didn't feel like it was just as effective as it was. I tried kind of fooling around a little bit to create a little bit more contrast by adding more shadow to John Travolta. I wasn't really happy with the final effect on it, so what I ultimately did was went back and changed the background and added some green to it. And in my mind's eye, that makes sense. If this car is driving and it's moving forward, then you have some outside view that you're looking at that is not just blue. It's not like they're floating in the air and we're seeing only the sky. Maybe they're driving by a neighborhood that has some trees in it. So we'll put some green shrubbery in the background, blurred a little bit, and then I'll create the effect that the car is in motion, but we're driving at street level and not floating in the air in the clouds somewhere or something like that. So again, really all we're talking about here is the touch-up work. And when it comes to touch-up, you know, that's can be something of a difficult thing for me from time to time. And what I mean by that is that when I get to this kind of end portion of the piece, I tend to get a little bit excited. I feel like this is, you know, something I'm proud of. I want to show it off. I can't wait to kind of throw my signature on the bottom and get it out onto social media and just kind of see what people think of it. You know, hopefully my audience is happy with it as I am. But when I do something like that, I can often do it premature, and then I go back and kick myself for all the little details I could have just touched up if I hadn't been so eager to get it out there. So what I try to do, at least with some of the more recent pieces that I've worked on, is to walk away from it. Again, it's really tempting to kind of say this thing is done and kind of get it out there, but you know, taking the time to walk away from it, at the very least for an hour, if not overnight, and then coming back and looking at it with fresh eyes later, can save you a lot of trouble, or at least it saved me a lot of trouble. Again, I'm kicking myself today over pieces that I've already published and I put out there, and I feel like I can't touch again because they've already been published, but there's just blatant mistakes I could have corrected if I'd just been patient and did a little bit of touch-up work. Now, if you remember back in the beginning, we already identified this scene. This is the scene where John Travolta shoots somebody in the face, so our last stage here is to put in our blood splatter. Blood splatter went in a couple different layers. Just like anything else, it needs to have some shadow applied to it. So I wanted to make sure I was really happy with the caricature before I kind of covered it up with the red. But once I got the red in, you'll notice it looks really flat. It's easy fix though. Again, put in some darker color there and just really kind of zoom in and focus in on some of that detail where I erased a little bit of the blood away, created a little bit more splatter, but more importantly got some shadow in there, and putting that shadow specifically where the shadow in the face lies. So that way it kind of gives it that same sense of contour that the jaw and the cheek have. I really try to be careful with not overdoing this, and again, I'm kind of speaking to my own imagination here. In my mind's eye, there is blood on Jules. It's just on the side of the face that you can't see because it's turned away from the camera. John Travolta obviously shot the gun, so a lot of the blood splatter landed on him, and hopefully it helps sell the joke here a little bit. It was tempting to put some of the blood on Jules, and certainly in the movie there was some evidence of it, like a little bit on his hand or something like that, but I opted not to do that because I really wanted to kind of sell the idea that John Travolta is the person that really kind of dealt with the aftermath of this more than anything else. Now, if you've seen the movie, you know there's a scene coming after this where they're both covered in blood, but again, I'm going for something of a narrative just in this one single image, and I made the decision that I made. So I already talked about the background. You can see I'm painting in the foliage right now, and that means we're coming up to the end of this piece. So all that's really left here is to put in our little punchline. I shot Marvin in the face, and I think that kind of sells the illustration, or at least the joke of the illustration that we're going for. Now, I hope you like this piece. I got a lot of attention on social media, so hopefully you kind of like the description here. Please, don't forget to take a moment here and subscribe. It really helps me out, and I'll be back more in the future with a few more videos. In the meantime, take care. Hope to see you again soon. Thanks.